Good afternoon to our early attendees. We want to welcome you to our session for today with Dr. Michael Lynch. If you would, and if you do have any questions throughout our session, there should be a question and answer box at the bottom of your screen. You can submit your question there, as well as if you'd like to do so in the chat box, you're more than welcome to do so. Our session will be recorded and posted on our FedEx Institute of Technology webpage, which will be periodically linked in the chat box at the bottom of the, in the chat box. So if you have any questions, please feel free to submit those as the presenter is giving his presentation. Thanks.
I think we'll wait just a few more minutes, see if there's more attendees. Okay. Welcome, everyone. My name is Deborah Tollefson. I'm a professor of philosophy here at the University of Memphis, and I'm also director of the Technology Serving Humanities Speaker Series. This is a new public lecture series launched by the FedEx Institute of Technology. It focuses on the social, political, legal, ethical, and philosophical aspects of technology, with the aim of broadening our understanding of technology's vast impacts. National and international scholars from the humanities, fine arts, communication, and the social sciences will be joining us this year. You can find out more about this series at the FedEx Institute of Technology website. Check the chat for a link. Today, I'm very pleased to introduce Dr. Michael Lynch. Dr. Lynch is a Board of Trustees Distinguished Professor of Philosophy at the University of Connecticut. He is the director of the Humanities Institute there and director of the New England Humanities Consortium. His work concerns truth, democracy, public discourse, and the ethics of technology. Lynch's newest book is called Know-It-All Society: Truth and Arrogance in Political Culture. His other books include The Internet of Us: Knowing More and Understanding Less in the Age of Big Data, In Praise of Reason: Why Rationality Matters for Democracy, Truth as One and Many, and the New York Times Sunday Book Review editor's pick, True to Life. He's the principal investigator for Humility and Conviction in Public Life, a $7 million project aimed at the understanding and encouraging of meaningful discourse, public discourse, funded by the John Templeton Foundation and the University of Connecticut. Lynch's work has been profiled in The New Yorker, The Washington Post, and Wired, among others. He speaks regularly to both academic and non-academic audiences and has appeared at such venues as TED, the Nantucket Project, Chautauqua, and South by Southwest. His talk today is entitled Social Media and Bald-Faced Lies. Welcome, Dr. Lynch.
Thanks so much for that very kind introduction. I appreciate that. And I'm going to just share my screen and we'll get started. All right, so I'm here to talk about a virus. Now, there are two viruses I think that we're all familiar with, sadly, stalking the globe right now. The first one, obviously, is COVID-19, the pandemic. But the second virus, you're also familiar with. That's viral disinformation, the virus of false misleading information spread rapidly online. And sadly, we're all familiar with this virus too. Now, there are a lot of contributing factors that play into why this phenomena of viral disinformation spreads so quickly online. And we need to understand the role of all these factors in order to actually, come to grips with the problem and help to alleviate it. The first such factor is one that, is in the news literally today, as Congress is hearing from the Facebook whistleblower. And that is trying to understand the role that social media platforms like Facebook and Twitter and Instagram play in helping to spread viral disinformation. We need to understand how that works in order to get a grip on the problem. We also need to understand the role of our own cognitive biases and gullibility. We are humans, we're fallible, and we fall victim to things like confirmation bias, the phenomena where we tend to, believe things that already fit our pre-existing views. So we need to understand ourselves. We also need to understand professional propagandists, of course, the role that they play, how various state actors and troll farms employed by them are dumping, deliberately dumping false information into our media environment. But also, and this is what I want to concentrate on tonight, we need to understand our own communication online. So here's the plan. I'm going to talk about two different kinds of political communication that make us vulnerable to the virus of viral disinformation. And I'm going to suggest that the fact that we misunderstand their function increases our vulnerability to viral disinformation. So let's start with sharing the news. We share a lot of stuff online. Obviously, we share pictures of our kids, of cute kittens, and mostly, of course, of ourselves. But one of the things that we do online is we share news posts. And by news post here, I mean posts that at least purport to be from reputable news sources. And especially around elections, or right now, seemingly all the time, people on Twitter and on Facebook in particular like to share news posts, and also in some countries on WhatsApp. And what are we doing when we do that? Well, it seems like, what we assume we're doing is conveying information we believe or think is plausible. That's what we tell ourselves anyway, that we're doing. When we're sharing a news post, whether it's from the Memphis Commercial Appeal or from the New York Times or any of Fox News or any other source, we tend to assume that we're trying to convey information that we believe, or at least we think is plausible or worth taking seriously. But what I want to think about is that whether that's really the function of this kind of communication. What I mean by that is the sharing of information we believe or think is plausible really what explains why news post sharing is so common on these sites, or as common as it is? In order to do that, in order to plumb the sort of question of whether that's really what's going on here, I think we need to think about things that we do and that we don't do online when we share news posts. Let's start with what we don't do. One thing we don't do, it seems, is shocking, I know, to none of you, is we don't tend to read what we're sharing. Of course, all of you listening do. I'm sure all of you read everything that you share 10 times before you share it, and read all the footnotes and all the references in those footnotes before you share anything, because you're deliberate and careful. But you might have suspected that some people actually share things very quickly without reading anything other than perhaps the headline. And social science data backs this up, not to mention, as we're finding out, the data from the research, from the platforms themselves. And in fact, many people do not even click through to the things that they're sharing. And that itself seems to suggest that we might be a little off in our assumption that what we're doing when we share news posts, generally speaking, is trying to share information. Because it's hard to share information if you don't know what it is you're sharing. Well, what do we do? Well, again, not a shocker, but we share content that expresses strong moral emotions like outrage or identity expressing values. Again, this is something that all of us see online, but we also have data to support this from actually quite large and growing social scientific literature. One of the, for example, the things that have sort of fallen out of this literature is that shares and retweets that contain strong moral language like referencing the other side committing fraud or even committing murder or doing all sorts of nefarious things, that sort of strong moral language is more likely to, it tends to make it more likely that your shares and your retweets will themselves be shared or retweeted. And that's not really surprising for two reasons. First, humans pay attention to what emotionally matters to them. And we know that. I mean, whether it matters to us because it causes warm and fuzzy feelings, like pictures of cute babies, or because it, pisses us off, like hearing news about what the other side is doing in politics. The other reason it's not surprising is that, as many of you or all of you here probably know, the social media economy, of course, rewards attention. It rewards eyeballs on posts. How does it do that? The algorithms that are the infrastructure of that economy promote posts that will attract attention, because attention is what social media platforms want you to give them. So therefore, if people are, attracted to things that elicit strong emotional reactions, in the social media economy, the algorithms that guide it will promote things that solicit strong emotional reactions. So let's go back to our question. Why do we keep sharing news posts? So notice how I put it. Why do we keep sharing news posts, even when it seems that we're not really often reading what we share, even if we say that we are, and we're sharing information that is heavily emotionally balanced? Well, not, it seems, to communicate information that we believe. Now, let me be careful. As I said before, lots of people do try to communicate information they believe by sharing news posts. But the question I'm asking is that the reason that this practice persists so much? Is this the as it were, primary function of the activity, of the communicative activity? I think that's unlikely. I think it's more likely, and lots of other researchers do as well, to think that the primary function of our sharing news posts online is to signal to each other our emotional convictions and values, to say to members of our tribe, hey, I'm on your team and not with the other guys. What are the implications of that? Well, for our purposes, the philosophical implications is that we aren't, in a sense, aware of the game that we are playing when we're engaging in this sort of sharing online. We think that we're engaged in a game of serious reason, of sharing facts and information so that other people can pursue knowledge and truth. That's the game we think we're playing. But really, the game that we're playing is a game whose rules are more like the rules of the playground or the water cooler conversation, the rules that have to do with passion and persuasion. And the fact that we are unaware of the game that we're playing here, I think, makes us vulnerable to those who are aware of what's really going on online and want to manipulate us. After all, the best cons happen when the con artist knows something that the mark doesn't know. When the mark thinks that one thing is happening, when actually something else is happening. All right, so we'll return to some of these lessons later on. But let's move on and talk about lies. Lies, 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 and bald-faced lies. So let's take a journey down memory lane and go all the way back to 2016. Nowadays, it seems really far away. In 2016, a man by the name of Edgar Welch walked into a pizza parlor in Washington, D.C., carrying an assault rifle. He was there, he said, to to self-investigate a bizarre conspiracy theory that alleged that Hillary Clinton and various other Democratic politicians and some Republican ones were involved in child sex trafficking in the basement of that pizza parlor, that very pizza parlor. Much to a surprise, but maybe to no very little other people's surprise, Edgar Welch found out that this conspiracy theory was outrageously false. Because not only did he not find a child sex trafficking ring in the basement of that pizza parlor, he didn't even find a basement because the pizza parlor didn't have one. Now, I mention this because Pizzagate, as it was called, was at the time seemed sort of an alarming phenomenon. It was a phenomenon where it seemed like a small amount of people, relatively speaking, but still, people seemed to be sucked into this online conspiracy theory that convinced them that sort of pretty implausible, to put it mildly, stuff was happening, and which would spread, virally in certain online communities around the internet. Still, a lot of us observing at the time thought, okay, sure, yeah, some people believe crazy stuff, but how bad could it get? Well, how naive we were. Because of course, as you all know, right now, people say a lot of weird stuff online nowadays. Here are some things that people say. COVID isn't real. Climate change isn't happening. The earth is flat, one of my favorites. Vaccines all contain microchips, tracking devices. And election fraud is the norm in the United States, not the exception. So, as I'm sure all of you know, these sorts of things are actually quite widespread, and some of them are very widespread in online discussions. People say these things all the time. And not just a few people, but lots of people. So what do these things have in common? Well, as the slide says, well, pretty obviously, they're obvious falsehoods. They're false. And they're obvious in the sense that obvious falsehoods in the sense that they're propositions for which there is, overwhelming and easily available evidence indicating they are not true. Now, let's say that a bald-faced lie is when you utter an obvious falsehood that you don't believe. So a really weird example, but an example, maybe not much weirder than the ones I just gave, but not involving politics, would be as if you were standing at a bus stop and somebody standing next to you said it's not raining. But here's the thing, it is raining. You're both getting drenched. And they turn to you and say, it's not raining. And if it was raining, I wouldn't be getting wet. Person's soaked. That, in a case like that, where you're at the bus stop, you probably at first think it was a joke because people just don't say things that are that obviously false. But if the person persisted, you'd get a little nervous and probably hope the bus came really quickly. That's because bald-faced lies in ordinary contexts are generally pretty rare, but they seem to be becoming sort of more common, perhaps, and that's the question I want to investigate in our political life. At the very least, obvious falsehoods, or what we would have used to have called obvious falsehoods, like the earth is flat, seem to be getting more and more commonly uttered online and shared. And that means I have questions. So here's my first question. Do all the people who spread these ideas really believe them? Well, some do. Clearly, some do. And after January 6th, it seems pretty clear that some people really do believe some of these things that I mentioned. But we might think, on the other hand, it's pretty clear perhaps, and for reasons that I'll give in a minute, that maybe not everyone who spreads these ideas does believe them, which would mean that they would be functioning like bald-faced lies, not just obvious falsehoods or misinformation. So here's my second question. Why do A, politicians, and B, ordinary voters like us, share things like this? why do we share stuff like this? Bizarre conspiracy theories. And I didn't even mention some of the most bizarre that you can encounter online. There are far more bizarre ones than the ones that I mentioned. So why do A, politicians, and B, ordinary voters share these things? So those are really two questions. I'm going to take them in order. So first, what function do bald-faced lies serve for politicians? I mean, why do they engage in this communicative act? And notice, this question I'm asking is similar in form to the question I asked about news post sharing. What's the function of this action that politicians sometimes seem to engage in? Well, you'll say it's obvious, to deceive people. They'll say things about climate change or COVID, perhaps, to deceive people because it fits their political view that they're wanting to get across. And that, of course, is often the case. Politicians, whether in the US or throughout history, have certainly been known to do their fair share of deception. But bald-faced lies and this sort of obvious falsehoods seem to be able to serve another purpose as well. And one reason to think that that's probably the case is because there are better ways often to deceive the public than just saying things that are really easy to show as being false. If, for example, a politician lies, as sometimes has happened in recent memory, about, let's say, the path of a hurricane, or whether the sun shined during an event when it didn't, or that there was photographic evidence for something there wasn't, then it's often very easy to sort of show that these claims are false. On the other hand, politicians, especially ones in office that are powerful, the government, for example, or not just the United States government, but governments around the world, can engage in all sorts of much more sophisticated ways of trying to get to deceive the public. They can plant false stories in the press, or they can shut the news media down. That is, prevent any news media but the state-owned news media from actually giving any information. So there are a lot of ways that governments can actually, and militaries and the like, can deceive those who they want to deceive in ways that seem more effective than engaging in obvious falsehoods. To put it bluntly, if you're trying to convince somebody that it's not raining when it is, probably your best tactic is not going to be to start out by just going up to them in the rain and saying it's not raining. Okay, so what would be the purpose of these sorts of communicative acts? Well, let's give an analogy. Imagine where you have a football game, and during the football game, one of the players takes the ball and runs way out of bounds. Like, by out of bounds, I mean way out of bounds, like, you know, behind the other team's bench, up in the stands, that sort of out of bounds, crazy out of bounds. And he takes the ball, he runs all the way down to the other side of the field, and he declares that he's made a touchdown. Now, in an ordinary game, that player would be thrown out, and if he persists, well, he might be asked to take a psychological evaluation in an ordinary game. But let's imagine a slightly different scenario. Let's imagine that this player is very powerful. Perhaps this player owns the field. And imagine further that half of the people in the stands are chanting along with him, not out of bounds, not out of bounds. Despite the fact that up on the Jumbotron, it's showing clearly that he was out of bounds. What's the point of him continuing to persist in this obvious lie? Why would he do it? Well, if you think about it, note what the sort of position it puts the other team in. If he has power, they're going to be reluctant to just perhaps directly confront him. So, but if they don't, if they just let it go, they let the lie go, then of course that's just as much saying that the rules really don't matter. Only what he says matters. On the other hand, they could give up the game and walk off the field, but that's forfeiting the victory. So I think this analogy is helpful for helping us understand the function that some bald-faced lies and obvious falsehoods play in online discourse by politicians, particularly on media like Facebook and Twitter. The function of such lies is that often they can be used to express power. And this is true for both online and offline lies of this sort. And again, I'm talking not just about standard, ordinary, everyday fibs, or even complicated lies about complicated things. I'm talking about things that are pretty obvious. So when it seems like in the case of the football analogy, the player who has power is using that bald-faced lie to express his power, to say that, well, what matters is what I say, not what's true. But one way that power is effective is that it gets people, that is in the public, in the real world, in the world of politics, to treat sometimes the lie as true, or at least not as false. Because it could force the other players, as I suggested, on the other team to go along as long as they wanted to continue to play the game. They sort of go along with it, or at least even if they don't believe it, they act as if it's at least not false. And getting either his followers or in the stands or the other team to act in a certain way is, after all, perhaps just as effective as getting them to believe in a particular thing. But remember my other question. What about those who are not in power, who repeat such lies? Okay, well, let's look at this to sort of explore that question, the question of why ordinary voters might repeat obvious falsehoods. They're not in power, so what's in it for them? Well, let's look at this, fairly well-known study by a bunch of political scientists, particularly Schaffner and Lux, done in 2018. What this study did is it took a bunch of American voters who either identified as voting for Clinton or voting for Trump or voting for somebody else or not voting at all. And what the researchers did is they put, among other things, they put these two pictures. These are famous pictures of different inaugurations in front of them and said, well, which picture, to you has more people in it? Notice they didn't ask which inauguration had more attendance. That's a different question and more complicated, frankly. You can't just, on that, you can't just go on a single photo. The question was much cruder than that. Just which picture seems to have more people in it? Now, this was really interesting result that they got. First, so as to be clear, almost everybody, no matter what their political persuasion, asked this question, said the picture on the left, the one that has more people in it, has more people in it. Okay, but still, they got a really statistically and very, very important result, which is that people who self-identified as having voted for Trump were 6 times more likely than the non-voters or people who voted for Clinton to give the other answer, to say the one that has less people in it had more people in it. Now, why is that? Well, one possibility is that people are deluded or something, and people actually believe that I don't know, numbers work differently than other people. But that doesn't seem very likely. It doesn't seem very likely because in some follow-up research done by some other researchers, particularly Bishop, 2019, and based on some earlier studies that were done, showed similar pictures, and in fact, in one case, the same picture to a similar groups of voters, and found that they could actually change the result if they told the various groups of voters that they would reward them financially. You'd make money if you answer the questions correctly. And when they did that, it turned out that people who would first say, when they weren't told that they had a financial reward, that, well, the one picture that doesn't have more people in it has more people, they would change their answer and give what is, obviously the correct answer. That is really interesting because it seems to suggest that in the first case, that some of the people who were answering the one way actually didn't really believe what they were saying. So what's going on? Well, I think that what's going on is newsflash. Some people spreading obvious falsehoods or reporting them or saying them, really obvious things that are false, don't really believe them. They're insincere in belief. So you'd say, well, they were just being insincere. They were, lying. But doesn't seem quite right. It doesn't seem to me that the Trump voters who were answering that way were actually engaged in, let's say, trying to deceive anybody. They weren't trying to deceive the researchers. They knew what the right answer was. They were engaged in a different form of communication. They weren't trying to communicate what they thought the answer was. They were communicating their political views. They were saying, look, I know what you guys are trying to get at, and I'm going to express the sincerity of my political conviction and political identity. I'm going to give you the answer that's consistent with that, not with what I, strictly speaking, believe to be true. So they're insincere in their belief, we might say, but sincere in their identity expression. And the lesson here is that political lies often serve to get us to act in a variety of ways as if the lies are true, or at least as if they're not false. That is to say things that are consistent with the lies being true for all sorts of reasons having to do with the expression and signaling of our political identity. So let's go back to the question that I asked. I said I had questions, and one of them was, do people really believe these lies? Well, as I've already said, obviously lots of people do, and that's a bad thing. But maybe actually many people don't believe them, and maybe most importantly, this is the wrong question of whether people really believe that COVID isn't real, even when they have COVID and are in the hospital. Maybe the real question is about commitment, about action, about conviction. For people act on these falsehoods, and it's action that matters in politics. And the kind of communication that I've been interested in is political communication online. So the conclusion that I want to leave you with tonight is that political online communication is often less about belief and the sharing of information than it is about emotion and tribal partisan convictions. But that is just as dangerous. Because while it's dangerous to deceive people into thinking that the world is a way in which it isn't, very dangerous, has been brought home in the pandemic, 700,000 deaths dangerous. It's also dangerous for us to not be aware of the fact that much of our political communication online and off is really aimed at the expression not of our beliefs, but of our partisan convictions and emotions. So I'm going to leave you with this last thought of Hannah Arendt, great philosopher of the 20th century, who says, before mass leaders seize the power to fit reality to their lives, their propaganda is often marked by extreme contempt for facts as such. For in their opinion, fact depends entirely on the power of the man who can fabricate it. Dark words from Hannah Arendt, but words worth contemplating at this moment in time. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Dr. Lynch. That was wonderful. We have time for questions, so if you want to use the Q&A function, and I'll give a few minutes as there's a little bit of a lag as people might type in there. And I'll take this opportunity to ask the first question. I was thinking about what I do in my own case, I don't read everything I share. But sometimes what I'm doing is more akin to pointing, rather than expressing any particular judgment or emotion or, yeah, I'm not saying yay or nay. I'm just saying, hey, look at this, because I have in mind, a friend's interests or something. I'm not interested at all in this, but I know so-and-so is. So maybe, yeah. So do you think could be part of it sometime?
Yeah, I think that's a really astute observation. A lot of what we do online is point out various things to each other. We point out information, and we point out people, or we point out things we find are funny, right? So pointing is a really great way of thinking about it, because pointing is an act of communication. It's not generally, although it depends, right? We can debate this in philosophy of language, whether it's an act of assertion. I think it maybe can be, but most of the time it's not. It's a more primitive, expressive act of communication. It's a type of literal signaling. It's a literal signal, right? Look, right? So I want to say, yeah, that is what we're doing. But I also want to just be careful to indicate that while many types of signaling online are perfectly, innocuous and fine, and we engage in them all the time, we're pointing out things that we think are funny, and they, because it's a kitten sort of trying to get upstairs, or maybe falling downstairs, or something like that. A lot of the signaling, including the pointing that we do online, I think about a lot of people do online, at least, is done for reasons that they might not fully be aware of, or if they were aware of, wouldn't be, let's say, particularly happy that they were engaged in it. Sometimes they would be. So pointing, so for example, even take humor, right? So political humor, right? We will point out something that we think is politically humorous. So we reference it, or we point out, as you said, something that we think somebody has interest in. And of course, I'm talking about political news posts, right? So we're in the realm of politics, not on other sorts of things we do online. In those cases, often the things that we're pointing out are things that we're pointing out because we want to show that we too can look in the direction that we feel the tribe is looking in. We too see what everyone else sees. We too see how terrible those people on the other side of the political fence are. We too, feel outrage at this thing that we know our friends feel outrage at. And that's, of course, a really good way. Pointing, literally pointing in a group environment is a really good way of, sort of signaling is always a good way of showing your solidarity with the group that you're in. I mean, if you think about the psychology of sports fandom, right? The sort of rituals that people engage in, including things like pointing, when they're in the stands in a sports game. What is a lot of the behavior, the waves we do, all that sort of stuff. A lot of that is about signaling to each other that we are on the same side and we're happy about it. And there's nothing wrong with that, right? There's a lot of that behavior, which is not necessarily a bad thing. But when it comes to political discussion online, I think we're less often aware that that's what we're doing. And I'll say that for myself too. I mean, like I talk about this stuff all the time, and so I find myself, finding myself like going to click, right, very quickly without always really paying attention to what I'm doing as much as I should be. And when I am doing certain things, I think about the fact that, well, what are my real motives here? And even if my motives are pure, what is the actual communicative function of the act that I'm engaging in, which could be different from the motives that I have. My motives could be pure, but the act itself may persist for reasons that have nothing to do with my motives. That is, persist in general online. That was a lengthy answer. I hope that was a great question.
Yeah, no, that's great. Thank you. And we have a few other questions here. Is there anything we can do to reduce the spread of misinformation individually or collectively?
Yes, clearly, I think there is. Collectively, we're finding right now, I think many, I'm sure all of you have been following the news today, where the Facebook whistleblower is been, as revealed through the Wall Street Journal initially, a lot of information about how social media platforms, particularly Facebook, and we are, in this case, talking about Facebook, is well aware that they're profiting off of the spread of disinformation, that their own research indicates that that's profitable. That's even to somebody like myself who writes about this stuff for a living, as it were. Some of the, and I haven't gone through all that data yet, I mean, all the information that's been released, it's pretty shocking. So one thing we can do is ask our legislators, who on this case, it's a bipartisan agreement. If you've been watching these congressional hearings today, Republicans and Democrats are appalled at this. And that's a rare thing in politics nowadays. So one thing we can do is encourage them to keep up that bipartisanship and to start asking really hard questions of Facebook and starting to, for example, consider an idea that has been floated by some, including in the papers today, the idea of having a new regulatory commission that's only directed at social media companies, that is only involved in trying to get straight on how to legislate proper media communication. There's a landmine of issues there, but that's one thing we can do, is encourage at least inquiries at the governmental level. The other thing we can do on an individual basis is just be more careful about what was said online. I hate to say it that simply, but one thing, but my own work has done is shown me I don't share as much online anymore. That isn't just post by myself, right? I just don't do it as much. I would suggest that you might think about doing that. There are other ways to get your information. And I think the fact that so many people get their news, and by some reports, the majority of people worldwide, not necessarily the United States, but worldwide, tend to get their news on Facebook feed or their Facebook feed. That's a problem. And I think we need to think about that both on a personal note and from the level of the governmental interaction. I hope that helped.
Do you see the technology of social media as being value neutral in the case of spreading falsehoods?
Yes and no. Part of the issue here is, I mean, yes, in a certain sense that the algorithms themselves, I think, I don't have any reason anyway to think that the algorithms, that is the deep learning networks that actually govern the interest, or actually can make up the backbone of the social media platforms, that those are in any way value oriented. They're not people. And in fact, deep neural networks, the types of algorithms that Facebook and Google in particular use are, well, first of all, they're proprietary, so it's difficult to know exactly their structure. But we know that they're probably black box algorithms, which is to say that they're algorithms that were also probably designed by other algorithms. And so human people actually would have a hard time explaining exactly how they work. That sounds weird, but it's for people in the industry, some of whom people may be here. That's not a newsflash. So because of that, the algorithms really don't work by people sitting down and saying, okay, I want to promote disinformation today, right? That's not what happens. The algorithms pick out things that people are doing online and watch what, as it were, not really literally watch, but notice the trails of ones and zeros, as it were, that we leave behind us as we surf the internet and engage in looking at things on social media. And then through means that are actually literally somewhat mysterious, these algorithms, mysterious not because it's magic, but because it's very complicated. These algorithms promote to us the things that we as individuals find of interest. So this is particularly salient on Google, right? So Google searches, sometimes people say, well, Google searches are are not value free. Maybe they're, in one sense, nothing's value free, and that's the other part of my answer. But in another obvious sense, these things are not people, the algorithms, and they don't have intentions, and they don't themselves have values. What they are is elaborate mathematical structures that are really good at tracking what we look at online and predicting what we're going to look at next. That's all they do. That's all they do. They track what we do and they predict what we're going to look at next. So so that's one answer. The other part of it is, are they, is no. I mean, or yes, they are. Excuse me. No, they're not value free because, of course, even though these algorithms themselves are not people with intentions or values, they are used by companies that, of course, are run at some point for profit, and profit is a value. So they're not, in that sense, value free. Are they more liberal, more the conservative? That's a question that gets thrown around a lot. I don't really see any evidence for that for the reasons I suggested. Also, remember that these things are global. Facebook is a global platform. It works all over the world, where politics is very, very different in other parts of the world. And the algorithms function in the same way. It's the same algorithm. It's just feeding people in Brazil very different sorts of information sometimes than what it's feeding people in Japan and in the United States and in Connecticut. And of course, it's feeding individual people quite different things as well, because what your preferences are different than mine. And what you're going to probably look at next is probably going to be different than mine. So I think that's a great question. That's my best attempt to answer a really deep and important question.
Okay, we have some questions in the chat. What, if any, repercussions are there for misrepresentations on social media? Does it vary, say, by state? Are there any, can you get in trouble for posting something that's false? Or
sure, you can, and there are legal questions, and I'm not a lawyer, so I won't give you a really what I would consider an expert answer on the legal side of things. But there obviously are legal ramifications for, let's say, saying online that, let's say, if you go online and you start spreading rumors about McDonald's, right, and it's poison in their hamburgers, right, then McDonald's has the ability in the court to take you to court and say, well, what you're saying is not true, and it's harming our business, and you need to stop or pay money to make up for the fact that you've lost us business. That's pretty common. That's how corporations will deal with misinformation spread about them. Of course, that's easier said than done nowadays. It used to be easier in a way for corporations to identify who was spreading misinformation, even if it was other corporations, because corporations do that to each other, as you probably know. On the other hand, nowadays, because the internet is so vast, that it's very difficult to keep track of what people are saying, either about corporations or otherwise. Now, when it comes to people, you can also harm a person's reputation by saying false things. And if they can prove that you harm their reputation and cost them something financially, for example, saying false things that can be problematic for that as well. Depends on whether they're a public figure, right? Now, as far as things like COVID, it's much more difficult, because if people are running around and saying that COVID isn't real online when it is, and people are suffering from it, are there repercussions for that? Well, there are repercussions not in the legal sense, that is the law, but of course the platforms themselves, because they are businesses, are allowed to regulate what people say on the platforms, because the platforms, right, have a First Amendment right to actually promote the communication with their business in the way that they want. So, for example, offline, a business can tell you to put on shoes before you come in the the business, or they can tell you that if you're making a disruption, they can ask you to leave. And you can't say, well, but it's my First Amendment right to scream and take off my clothes in the middle of the business. No, it's not really, because it's a private business. The private business gets to regulate what it wants. Same with things like Facebook and Twitter. So Facebook and Twitter can take, measures to prevent other people from using them. That, of course, raises questions that are going on right now, whether Facebook and Twitter should be run as private corporations. Of course, the alternative is to have them run by the government, but that itself raises a bunch of other questions about whether we want the government to be regulating, let's say, owning, not regulating, owning corporations. So, the question earlier, I said one way to try to crack down on disinformation is to try to put pressure on Facebook and Twitter to do that themselves, and do that through the government, through regulation. That is, to make it more difficult for Facebook and Twitter to engage in practices that allow for people to say false things, let's say about COVID. On the other hand, the more regulation that you engage in, the more you might worry about impinging the rights of corporations to make money as they see fit. And therein lies a very complicated questions that we've actually encountered before in this country with regard to the regulation of things like the transportation industry and railroads. So I'll leave it at that.
Great. There's a comment here, I think, following up on the algorithm, the value neutrality of algorithms. Imagine socially benevolent algorithms engineered with filters that steer towards socially beneficial ends. Probably backfire with unintended consequences, but an interesting thought experiment about how one might design them.
Yeah, that's a really interesting thought. It is and the questioner is right to wonder whether there might be unintended side effects, as there often are when we try to do things that are guided or are aimed in this direction. It would be, one thing that would make that, of course, difficult to do is because it's more complicated than the sort of way the system that we have now. The algorithms are very mathematically complicated, but as I said, at root, they do one simple thing, or two simple things. They track our preferences, and they track what we look at, and they predict what we're going to look at in the future. That's what they do. And that's pretty simple. That's all they do. So if you search, for, as we all know, you're searching for a new pair of boots online, or a particular book or something, or a refrigerator, you're going to get a lot of ads for refrigerators and boots of just the sort you were probably looking for on the platforms that you engage in after that, right? In all likelihood, unless you turned off the advertising functions on those sites. That's because of the way the algorithms look. And that's a particularly obvious example. But of course, the algorithms are often much more clever than that. And all of you can use examples from your own life. So in order to do something like what the questioner is related, and I've thought about this myself, both individually and together with other researchers, you need to figure out how to structure the algorithms, which are themselves, as I said, just done. They're not intelligent things in our sense of intelligent. They're not humans. How to identify values and predict that people are going to re-engage with those values. That's going to be a difficult problem, maybe not insurmountable. It's something we need to work on. I'll give you one quick anecdote about how these things can. So at one point in my life, I was fortunate enough to I was working on this topic, and I was out with drinks with some senior vice presidents at Facebook and Twitter and Google and a few other companies. And it was like a big moment, because I was like, oh my goodness, I have a chance to actually maybe say something to people that, make decisions about this stuff. And at the time, this was a number of years ago, I pitched to them an idea, which I was very serious about. And the idea was, hey, instead of on Facebook, instead of having, thumbs up or angry face, happy face, surprise face as our choices for reaction, why not on when people share, like news and stuff like that, why couldn't we have the choice of justified by the evidence, unjustified by the evidence, and need more information? All right, typical. And so, I said this very seriously. And they thought that was the funniest thing that anybody had ever said, ever. They thought I was like making the funniest joke. It was so funny to them that like one person had gone off to the bathroom and come back and they were like, say it again, right? That's how funny they thought this was. And, in retrospect, they were right to find it funny because of course, what they knew, and I didn't know at the time, is that of course, our own behavior is part of the problem. Our own behavior, and that's what I was talking about tonight, not the social media platforms, not the algorithms, our own behavior makes this problem very hard. Because what I am predicting, based on what I said tonight, is that what I think they already knew, is that if we change the choices in the way that I suggested, we would pretty soon start to treat those choices as boo, yay, yeah. Right? We would treat them as emotional signals because that's how we are as human beings. That's part of what makes this problem so hard. It's not just the algorithms, it's not just the social media platforms, it's us.
Great. Are there any more questions? To see, I don't see any in the Q&A or the chat. So thanks so much, Dr. Lynch, for this. We are grateful for everybody that showed up this afternoon. Please join us November 12th for our next speaker. This will be a face-to-face event with Dr. Clinton Castro, Associate Professor from Florida Atlantic University. His talk is titled Egalitarian Machine Learning. Again, details about this talk and others in the series can be found on the website. Thanks very much, everybody.
Thank you so much, and thanks for having me. It was a lot of fun. Great questions. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all.